They said because we've invested enormous quantities of materiel, radars, missiles, missile launchers, and so forth, lots and lots of training in Qatar. In other words, he simplifies it, which is what you do when you're trying to foster support or cultivate hatred. The simpler you make it, the easier it is. That we're in the same position we were beforehand, and we've said, well, we don't care. It's just irrelevant to us. It's wrong to say the Israeli state. You have this international Jewish capital and banking power and financial power that is inextricably intertwined with the Israeli state. Driving people out is never the end, especially when they're leaving a place where they've lived for thousands of years. Remember, this is something Americans need to understand. That is not the same as what's happening in Gaza or the West Bank. As long as they're gone, if they're not there and they don't exist anymore, then they're not a threat. And then at the same time, he's looking at his American audience and he is saying, fine, that's Israel's decision. It wasn't ours. Wrong. If we had objected to it, we could have stopped it. And we could have put some teeth behind that by saying, if you go ahead and murder these people.
Well, first of all, he says Israel owns the consequences. Then he turns around and makes it clear that no, we and Israel both own the consequences, because our position vis-a-vis Israel is unchanged just because the Israelis chose to ignore whatever we consider to be international norms or international law, which, let's be frank, have not meant a great deal to the Israelis, and admittedly, we flaunted it whenever we saw fit to do so, that, we're in the same position we were beforehand, and we've said, well, we don't care. It's just irrelevant to us. And I think you're going to hear an awful lot of crying and whining out of the Arab countries, but I don't see a whole heck of a lot of action from them at this point, and action is much more important than words. And I would go one step further. I've checked with people I know who are in the defense industries who are involved, and Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. And they both said to me categorically, if the Qataris had wanted to stop the Israelis, they could have done so. And I said, well, explain that. They said, because we've invested enormous quantities of material, radars, missiles, missile launchers, and so forth, lots and lots of training in Qatar. They have probably some of the finest air and missile defenses that exist anywhere in the world. It is simply impossible that Qatar could not have known the Israelis were coming. They would have identified that. And if they had identified it in advance, they would have said, you're violating our airspace. You can't do that. If you continue, we reserve the right to respond. Well, none of that happened. None of it happened, I think, because Qatar was well aware the Israelis were coming. And of course, we were as well. Nothing flies over that region of the world in the Arabian Peninsula, whether it's in the Euphrates River Valley and in Iraq, or further south over the Persian Gulf. We know exactly what's in the air at any given point in time. So we knew, Qatar knew. So all this whining about what the Israelis have done, I think, is more theater than reality. The truth is, the people that live in the Arabian Peninsula, the majority of these Arab leaders, really don't give a damn what happens to the people in Gaza or in the West Bank. I wish it were different, but that's my conclusion. So, as far as Rubio is concerned, Rubio is maintaining the status quo. Fine. That is Israel's decision. It wasn't ours. Wrong. If we had objected to it, we could have stopped it. And we could have put some teeth behind that by saying, if you go ahead and murder these people, we'll stop supporting you in these areas. We didn't do any of that. We're not going to do any of that. Because frankly speaking, at this point, Israel owns us. When I say Israel, it's wrong to say the Israeli state. You have this international Jewish capital and banking power and financial power that is inextricably intertwined with the Israeli state. All of that brought together, whether it's in the United States or Great Britain or Israel or anywhere else, constitutes tremendous influence because they are able to literally buy politicians, and they've done it. And you mentioned, I was just looking here as we're on the air. This is this afternoon in local time. This is the results of that GCC meeting. Arab Muslim leaders urge review of Israel ties after attack on Hamas leaders in Doha, which is almost exactly what you just said. It's going to be a lot of words and apparently no action. That seems to be the consequence. Just review. Yeah. I mean, review means, oh, we'll re-examine it. Well, there's nothing to examine. You're on one side or the other. And they've effectively said, we don't care what happens in Gaza or the West Bank. We're just not interested. We want to get on with life. This is more of a, what's the right word, an irritant than anything of strategic importance to us. It's sad, but that seems to be the truth. There's more interest, I think, certainly in Iran and certainly among the Turks and maybe other countries, Algeria. I think the Egyptian population, I think the Arab populations of the peninsula are all enraged, but they don't have any governing power, so they can be enraged. But they're going to change nothing. Well, I think that's true. I think there are two things right now that should be taken away from Mr. Netanyahu's remarks and the positions that he's articulated in public. Number one, if all of these people that are currently living in Gaza are either dead or gone, they present no threat to Israel. Therefore, we will tolerate no threat to Israel from Gaza. Ergo, you've got to either kill everyone there or drive them out.
Frankly, from his vantage point, it doesn't matter which, as long as they're gone. If they're not there and they don't exist anymore, then they're not a threat. And then at the same time, he's looking at his American audience and he is saying, we've learned over many centuries that there is nothing more reliable than a man who can be bought with cold, hard cash. And that's what they've done. If anybody thinks that our Congress is full of hundreds of people who are personally, emotionally, intellectually committed to give their lives on behalf of the state of Israel, they're delusional. That's not the motive. So I think those are the two things that we need to take away from this. Now, the problem, of course, is that even though they may be dead, most of them, or all of them, that doesn't necessarily mean that this will not haunt Israel. This does not necessarily mean that justice at some point in some fashion will not come about. That's the lesson of history.
Driving people out is never the end, especially when they're leaving a place where they've lived for thousands of years. Remember, this is something Americans need to understand. There's a big difference between taking groups of illegals who have come into the United States illegally and tried to lose themselves inside the population, rounding them up and saying, thank you very much. You violated the law when you came here and you've got to leave. Therefore, we're transporting you out of the country. That is not the same as what's happening in Gaza or the West Bank. The people living there have been there for at least 1,000 to 2,000 years. They're not newcomers. They're not recent arrivals. If anyone falls into that category, the Israelis are closer to it than they are. But the newcomers have decided that they need to go. And so they're being eliminated. They are being systematically rooted out, killed, or driven out. End of discussion. And we support it. And you mentioned this a second ago, but we've been talking about the Gaza Strip mostly today. But there's also the West Bank, where are alleged around 3 million additional Palestinian people who seem to fall into the same weary eye from Israel, who also wants them out of there too. And now then there's talk about whether there will be an annexation and whether we will support that. So Rubio was also asked that question. One thing that comes next, at least for the Israelis, sir, is they are talking about their new plans to move ahead with annexation of the West Bank. Is that something the Trump administration is supportive of? Well, we're not commenting on that now, other than to say that we warned all these European capitals and other countries that if they went ahead with this Palestinian state recognition, which really is symbolic more than anything else, they're responding to their own domestic politics. We warned that there would be a response to that. You know, there's this feature in media when you're being interviewed or whatever on a television or something, where you block and pivot that the interviewer asks you a question, you don't want to answer it. So you block and then you pivot to what you want to talk about already. That is about I almost got the whiplash just watching that one, because she asked about annexation of the West Bank. And then he did a 180-degree turn on a totally different subject. And instead of talking about whether the U.S. would authorize something that is absolutely blanket against any kind of international law, the annexation of another of the Palestinian territory, which is also the people have been there for hundreds or thousands of years, he then turns on our allies in Europe and says that, how dare you recognize a Palestinian state? There will be consequences. So when Israel attacks Qatar, they're not our ally per se, but we have a military base there. And certainly they were doing what we asked them to do when they went there. No words at all against Israel. That's just their deal. But when our actual allies do something that's in their own domestic interest and recognize a Palestinian state, regardless of whether we think it's a good idea or bad doubt, he says that there will be consequences for that. What do you make of that? I think that he's being partially accurate when he talks about the response, say, in France to what is happening in Gaza, because 1 out of every 5 adults in France is now a Muslim, primarily from North Africa or the Middle East. But when you look at the rest of Europe, and the Europeans are opposed to this, the Europeans are not opposing this on the grounds that they are compelled by the presence of a foreign element in their country that is threatening to them. I don't think so. I think there's a recognition of what is right and what is wrong. But of course, he's not going to say that. We have a population that is showing very little interest. So there is no real pressure on the American government to take a strong position against what the Israelis are doing. On the other hand, we have tremendous influx of hundreds of millions of dollars in cash, billions over time, that are paying for our support for Israel. That's a simple fact. He's not going to say that publicly, but that's true. But Rubio is a very astute politician. He's learned how to avoid these thorny issues as long as possible. But he knows, just as you and I know at this point, that we'll stand by and support the same ruthless war of extermination being waged in Gaza against what remains in the West Bank. It's inevitable. We will. We're not going to change our position at all, because there's no incentive for the people on the Hill to give up their luxurious funding. Well, and speaking of the people on the Hill, there was a meeting last night in Jerusalem where Benjamin Netanyahu spoke before a very friendly audience of Israeli and American people. And according to one report I saw on X this afternoon, I can't validate the number, but allegedly up to 250 members of Congress were in attendance at this meeting. And in the process of this conversation, Netanyahu said a couple of very interesting things I want to talk about. First of all, as it turns out, Israel is under siege, and we will have to do several things to break loose from this siege that is organized by a few states. One is China and the other is Qatar. And they are organizing an attack on Israel legitimacy in the social media of the Western world and the United States. We will have to counter it, and we will counter it with our own efforts. I think that's rule number one. The second thing is something that they can do uniquely in Western Europe. Western Europe has large Islamist minorities. They're vocal. Many of them are politically motivated. They align with Hamas. They align with Iran. They pressure the governments of Western Europe, many of whom are kindly disposed to Israel, but they see that they're being overtaken really by campaigns of violent protest and constant intimidation. And so they fall into this siege, and we can break this siege. So as it turns out, the little Israel is the victim in all this. And of course, he's going to characterize everything that's going on in Europe. And all this is not a reaction to the grotesque violation of human rights and just the slaughtering and the even the starvation of the population in Palestine, killing women and children with no compunction at all. It can't be that. No, it has to be they are pro-Hamas or pro-Iranian. Specifically, the two big bugaboos for the United States there that make them eager to support Israel. What do you make of his characterization? Well, he wants to equate anyone who does not support his liquidation of the Arab population, Palestinian Arab population in Gaza or in the West Bank, with support for Hamas. In other words, if you don't support Israel, then you support terrorism, you support Islamist terrorism, you support Sharia law. I mean, just all this nonsense. Of course, that's not right. There's a difference between someone who is, a fanatical Islamist who wants to kill Christians and Jews and anyone who's different from them. And these people are overwhelmingly Sunni, and so they hate Shiites as well. We know all about that. There's an interest between that and what you're talking about in the West. I think Hamas is a dangerous organization that the world would be better off without. Am I prepared to support the wholesale liquidation of the population where Hamas was founded in order to achieve that aim? Probably not. Is it worth noting that Hamas is a creature of Israeli foreign policy? In other words, foreign politics towards the Palestinians? Yes, it is. Hamas was funded with Israeli money. It stood up as an alternative to the Palestinian Authority, which in the view at the time of Mr. Netanyahu and others was moving in directions they didn't want to go. In other words, he simplifies it, which is what you do when you're trying to foster support or cultivate hatred. The simpler you make it, the easier it is. He knows that hating in the plural works. If you can cultivate collective hatred, that's a very powerful weapon. Now, he thinks he's cultivating that against the people of Gaza and, frankly, the Muslim Arabs and others in the region. I think he's wrong. I think he's actually cultivating hatred against Israel and Jews. Anyway, he walked in and he gave a presentation, and the presentation opened with the following words. This war will last at least 3 years. It will require the whole manpower and industry of the British Empire and at least 2 million men in the field. Everyone was shocked. And people in the room listened to this. They looked at each other and whispered, if we had known this, we wouldn't have declared war. But it was too late. He walked in, he told the truth. That's my great concern right now, that we're equally oblivious to the dangers. We don't understand the consequences. We're not ready. We need to stop behaving badly. We need to come to terms with the people that we insist are our opponents. But you see, we have become so self-righteous, so hypocritical, and so enamored of ourselves that we can't do it. That's dangerous. I think this foolish calculations taking us deeper into war, though, that this process already started. If you remember back in March of 2022, it was said that Russia only had a few days left of missiles and artillery. If you put sanctions on them, the economy would collapse before the weekend was over. And of course, the whole world would join in on the isolation of Russia. So again, that was 3.5 years ago. And now we only go for escalation. But of course, if someone would have said this 3.5 years ago, that we're going to supply and start to do long-range strikes into Russia, probably people would have been a bit more concerned. But It's this slow incrementalism, this salami tactics that gradually pulls us into this, which makes it very difficult to pull out as well and accept the losses. What would you tell the president if he said, Cannell, I don't give a damn what the world thinks. We're the United States. We tell the world what to think. I don't care what Ukraine, Russia, Putin, the SEO bricks, the hell with these people. We're the United States. It's our way or the highway. Your response, sir? Well, that may have worked 80 years ago when the world was in ruins and had no choice. But the world's not in ruins anymore. And you're not dealing with the rest of the world as though you're the lone superpower. That sort of, what do they call it? The unitary MO or unipolar moment. That's over. We live in a world with many great powers. It's in our interests to respect the interests of other countries. You know, one of the things that President Trump will tell you is we have legitimate security interests in Mexico. We have legitimate security interests in the Caribbean and the Caribbean basin. Well, I agree with him. He's right. But suddenly, Russia has no legitimate security interests in Ukraine. Doesn't make any sense, does it? In other words, the Russians and the Chinese would immediately grant us that we have legitimate security interests in the Caribbean and Central America that outweigh their own, no question about it. But we will not grant them a similar interest in their own areas. Don't they have a Monroe Doctrine? Don't they have their own Monroe Doctrine? I mean, the Monroe Doctrine is overblown. I mean, we talk about that, but it was never really enforced. And no, I don't think that's the issue. I just think before you walk into a room with anybody to talk to them, you need to understand what are their interests. You know, now Putin is very straightforward. He is not opaque. He's not hiding anything. You meet with him, he'll tell you right up front, these are interests. In fact, Putin just talked the other day and they said, well, President Trump now is threatening to collapse the Russian economy. He says he's going to collapse it because he's going to ensure that everybody doing business with Russia is punished, and that if he can get all of his European allies and strategic partners around the world to stop buying oil and gas, then that will collapse the Russian economy. Well, the first question I had is that sounds a lot like Joe Biden. Why are you saying that, President Trump? How is it in our interest to collapse the Russian economy? Is it because they refuse to do what we have demanded that they do in Ukraine? Well, they have interest in Ukraine, just as we have interest in Mexico. We would not allow things to get out of hand in Mexico with a foreign force on the ground there that threatens us. They're in the same boat. So I think the problem that he has is he doesn't understand what Washington said. You have to live in the larger community of nations, understand what everybody's interests are. Then you maneuver through the ocean or sea of changing interests. But the overriding objective that Washington had, that Eisenhower had, was war avoidance. Avoid a war. The use of military power is the last option. It's not number one or number two on the list. To the very top. And I think there's a part of President Trump that likes to feel I'm tough. I'm tough. I'm the guy. I'm the godfather. I'm in charge. And you do what I say or you've had it. You know, the Venezuelans are, I was just going to, I can't believe you said that, by the way. And let's not forget the Department of War, sir. The Department of War. You must like that, Colonel, don't you? After all, we're about war, aren't we? I hope we're about national defense. And I logged whatever we can do to defend the United States and the Western Hemisphere and our territories. But no, war is the last option. And that's why we got rid of Department of War. By the way, if you resurrected everybody who fought in the Second World War and told them we were going back to that, they'd be horrified. Let me do two things. First of all, you remember President Kennedy and President Nixon, both of them served in the United States Navy in the Pacific during World War II. I think Reagan did too, but I'm not sure. You have to go back and check that, but whatever. But Nixon and Kennedy were both in the Pacific in the Navy during the war. And they came out of that with a feeling that, my God, look at what we did. Thousands of ships and tens of thousands of aircraft, airplanes. We're the most powerful force on the planet. And they were very enamored of all of that. Well, Eisenhower, who becomes president in the 1950 seconds, he saw the Second World War. He saw a very different war. He saw hundreds of thousands of killed, dead American servicemen, hundreds of thousands who were wounded, and he remembered the carnage of the war. And one of the things that he concluded after the Second World War was over is that we must never do this again. We are not suited to this. He looked at the Soviets, he looked at the Nazis, and he said, these people lost millions, and they had a different culture, a different nation, a different way of life. We can't do that. And so Eisenhower recounted how he called or sent a note to Marshall, and this was in early January 1945 because we were still in the middle of the bulge, which shocked everybody. No one expected the Germans to build an army of old men and boys and a handful of veterans and throw them at us. And people don't understand, we lied about all the casualty figures. We now know the real casualties. And the real casualties are not pretty. We said the Germans had 200,000 casualties. No, they didn't. They had 68,000. We, on the other hand, had over 120,000 casualties. How many Germans were killed? 11,000. We said that we killed 50 or 60,000. How many did we lose? We were somewhere between 25 and 30,000 dead on top of the over 120,000 casualties. We were taking 90,000 casualties a month up until the bulge. Then we took 100,000 a month. Now, Eisenhower went through this, and Eisenhower said, he wrote this note to Marshall. He said, I'm going to need more divisions if we're going to cross the Rhine and end this war. And Marshall said, you've got all of the divisions you are going to get. There is nothing more to send. You need to end this war with what you have. Now, that was also because Marshall and FDR had had a conversation. FDR said, you better explain this to that man. We're tapped out. We can't do anymore. How many times have you heard anybody say that who was at lower levels, like Nixon and Kennedy? They had a very narrow picture. What they saw was very virtuous and good, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't the big picture. Eisenhower had the big picture. Today, Trump needs a big picture if you'll listen. And that big picture says, don't dare challenge anybody to a major war anywhere. Right now, our economy is weak. Our financial system, depending upon who you want to listen to, is on the road to collapse.